Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. Well, it's no secret we've got an upcoming election, and I'm interested in elections in general. So we're going to talk about elections throughout American history. And with us to do that today is a distinguished professor of history at American University and the author of many acclaimed books on political theory, including White Protestant Nation, The Rise of the American Conservative Movement, Professor Allan Lichtman. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Michael. My pleasure.
As far as I know, the first few elections weren't very momentous in the country, but that changed with the election of 1800. What happened in the election of 1800? Like, what was in your view, the most interesting thing about it? To me, it was the result that I find
Yes.
interesting. But I'd like you to tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, this was the first genuine political party opposition election. Political parties really had just begun to form in the late 18th century, and the election of 1800 clearly pitted the Federalist John Adams against what they called the Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson, sometimes called the Jeffersonians. And they had fundamentally different outlooks on the country and policy. The Federalists favored a commercial, industrial type of nation. They believed in deference to the elite. They were very much pro-England in its conflict with the French. Thomas Jefferson and his followers had the image of an agrarian nation, a nation of small, self-sufficient yeoman farmers. They believed in a limited government and favored France in its conflict with England. And, talk about dirty politics. This was one of the dirtiest elections in American history. The Federalists claimed that blood would flow in the streets if Thomas Jefferson would be elected. The Jeffersonians claimed that John Adams planned to marry off one of his sons to the English royal family and reestablish a monarchy in America. And it was also remarkable in that no one actually won the Electoral College vote. In those days, there was no presidential ticket. The first place finisher, provided they got a majority in the Electoral College, was elected president. The second place finisher elected vice president, even if they represented utterly different views, as you had earlier with Adams and Jefferson. And every elector cast 2 votes. And kind of the team of the Jeffersonians was Jefferson and Aaron Burr, New York politician. And some electors were going to withhold their vote from Burr, so Jefferson would finish first and Burr second. Well, that didn't happen. They tied. And under the Constitution as it then existed, and still does, the election forfeits to the House, with each state having just 1 vote. So Rhode Island had the same number of votes as New York or Virginia. And it went on for multiple ballots till close to the inauguration day, which was March 4th in those days. And finally, the logjam was broken in favor of Thomas Jefferson. And this led to fundamental changes in the American presidency and American politics. It led to a long period in which the Federalist Party would fade away, and we really had almost a one-party system of the Jeffersonians. And it led to a fundamental constitutional change, the 12th Amendment, adopted in 1803, which created the modern ticket system. You would now vote separately for president and vice president on a party ticket, rather than just casting 2 votes.
And Aaron Burr, although initially going in, he knew he was to be vice president and Jefferson president, because somebody just, like you said, each elector got 2 votes, and nobody bothered to instead of voting Jefferson and Burr on every ticket, nobody bothered to switch that up. And that's how Burr ends up tied. And Burr then actually went with this. He didn't just bow out gracefully and say, "Oh no, I'm the vice president," right? Like, he actually thought he might be president.
Burr, if anything, was ambitious. you know, as the old Shakespearean line,
Yeah.
he has a lean and hungry look, too ambitious. And he saw his opportunity and he came close. As I said, it went from many, many ballots before the House voted for Jefferson.
Now, in 1824, there's another big election, and there's many candidates on the ballot. There's Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, I believe Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson takes the popular vote, which in America it doesn't matter. I get that, but it ends up with Quincy Adams being president. What went down there, and how
Yeah,
did Andrew Jackson react?
yeah. You had, four serious candidates. You mentioned three of them. The other was the Secretary of the Treasury, who was kind of a minor candidate, but still got a good number of votes. Crawford. Jackson wins the popular vote, and he wins a plurality of the electoral college vote, but not a majority. And that means, again, the election defaults to the House, with every state having one vote. And who's the Speaker of the House? Henry Clay, a defeated candidate who absolutely hates Andrew Jackson and has been an antagonist of Jackson for many years. And he influences the House to elect John Quincy Adams, even though he finished second in the electoral and popular vote count. And that's perfectly legal, perfectly constitutional. But then Adams appoints Henry Clay Secretary of State, which in those days was considered the jumping off point to become president. Andrew Jackson charges this was a corrupt bargain. But look, in contrast to Donald Trump, who legitimately lost in 2020, but wouldn't accept it, Andrew Jackson accepted his defeat, conceded, and said, I'm going to get revenge in 1828, and he sure did. Overwhelmingly defeated John Quincy Adams and becoming a two-term president.
In your view, what's the most momentous election that the country's ever had? I think I know what you'll say. I have my view, but I'm interested to what a actual
Yeah,
historian
I
thinks.
always resist the most because there are certainly several that would vie for that. But an easy one is 1860,
That's what I
obviously.
was aiming for.
Yeah,
Yes.
significant on multiple levels. First of all, it established the modern political system of Republicans versus Democrats. That was the first clear Republican versus Democratic election. It elected a president who, in the consensus of authorities in the field, is certainly one of the top three and maybe the leading president. And of course, it immediately led to the withdrawal of Southern states, many of whom withdrew even before Lincoln was inaugurated, and the bloody Civil War that projected on today's population would have resulted in the deaths of many, many millions, but at least finally settled the question of slavery.
Once and for all, right? Well, yes, I would say once and for all
Yes,
that was
but
settled.
not in practice, of course, because at the end of Reconstruction, when white supremacists recaptured Southern governments, they didn't formally reestablish slavery. You couldn't do that. That was barred under the 13th Amendment, but they came close with their
Sure.
system of Jim Crow.
Sure. They had the convict lease programs there, and they had
Yes.
the sharecropping. So
And segregated schools, public
yeah.
facilities, hotels, transportation, you name it.
So in 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes gets elected president. But again, there's this sort of idea of a corrupt bargain taking place. First of all, who did he run against, and what happened? Was it
Yeah.
controversial?
He ran against a very strong Democrat, Samuel J. Tilden, the governor of New York. And this was the last throes of Reconstruction. And governments were in turmoil between the old Reconstruction governments and the new governments dominated by the white supremacists. And three states, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida, it's always Florida somehow, it was uncertain who actually won those states, even though Tilden clearly won the popular vote. There were competing slates of electors coming out of those states. And what does the Constitution say about how you resolve that? Nothing. And so Congress had to improvise. It set up a commission of 15 individuals, members of Congress and the Supreme Court, that was supposedly to be divided between 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and 1 independent justice. Well, but that independent justice was then elected to the Senate and couldn't serve, and the only justices left to serve were Republicans. So the committee had 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats, and guess how it voted on every critical issue? 8-7. And that led to all kinds of jokes, Rutherford Hayes, old 8-7. But Hayes was, very magnanimous. He said, look, I understand the country's divided. I'm going to try to govern from the center. And I promise you, I'm only going to serve 1 term, which he did. And again, even though Tilden had vastly more justification than Trump to dispute the results, while he waited a while, he ultimately did conform to the great American tradition of conceding and allowing the peaceful transfer of power to take place.
Now, wasn't part of the reason that Hayes was able to get in was that he agreed to some changes to the system that was set up under Reconstruction? Or do I have my history wrong?
Yeah, you're right and wrong. Yes,
Okay.
he did agree to withdraw the troops from the South, but that was inevitable. Reconstruction really was in its last legs, and there was no way that Reconstruction was going to be sustained, no matter what, beyond the election of 1876.
Now, the first election between Grover Cleveland and I want to say Benjamin Harrison. Was that okay? That's another situation where Cleveland wins the majority popular vote. Harrison ends up president, right? This is after Cleveland already served 1 term. What was the reaction in the country to that happening?
Pretty much not much of a reaction because frankly, the popular vote was so close. It wasn't like, he ran away with the popular vote. And the reason he wins the popular vote is because now the Democrats control the South and Democrats pile up, huge margins of victory in the South. So it didn't yield the kind of controversy we saw in 1824 or 1876.
Now, Cleveland, he was involved in a pretty ugly election. I don't know if it was the one that he lost or one of the 2 that he won, but I just remember watching a documentary where one of the commercials had to do with an illegitimate child or something.
Yes.
Mama, where's my pa? Going to the White House. Ha ha ha. So that stuff, that type of stuff has been with us. Like you said, I mean, with Adams and Jefferson, like since the beginning. So when people talk about politics is ugly nowadays, it's always been ugly, right?
It's always been ugly. And Jefferson himself, was stung with a sex scandal, not just having sex with his dependent slave, Sally Hemings, but fathering several children with
Yeah.
her. That was accurate. That happened. And it was pretty accurate that Cleveland had his mistress too. But none of these sex scandals derailed any president, these early ones or later ones.
So I remember when I was a kid, Gary Hart, he was running for president, and Donna Rice, that whole thing, that kind of derailed him.
Derailed his candidacy.
Yeah, derailed his candidacy. But thinking about it, you're right that it doesn't really have the effect that I think it. Popular opinion seems to be that up until Clinton and then of course Trump, that these things had a big effect, but I guess they really didn't.
They really haven't had a big effect. The truth is, any number of presidents engaged in affairs. And, oddly, the most notorious womanizer is not very well known. It's not John F. Kennedy. It's not Grover Cleveland.
Can I
It's
take a stab? Hold
Warren
on.
Harding.
Okay, I was going to say Franklin Roosevelt, but okay.
No, Franklin Roosevelt had a mistress. Warren Harding had many and
Did he?
engaged much more actively. We have uncovered letters from Warren Harding to his mistress, Carrie Phillips. This is back in 1920s. They would create a blush for Stormy Daniels today. They were so explicit, even talked about his member, which he named, and, just unbelievably cringeworthy stuff. And he also had another affair in the White House with a woman by the name of Nan Britton, and she sued him for paternity, sued his estate because he died. And she, like Stormy Daniels, was vilified and attacked and slut shamed. And later evidence proved she was right. It was her kid.
Now, was this what killed him? The affairs? Is that what put him out of commission?
No one knows what killed Warren Harding. He just died mysteriously in 1923 on a trip to Alaska.
It wasn't Coolidge, though, right? There's no sign of some foul play, right? Coolidge
No,
didn't
not
knock
really.
him off.
Although there are a lot of rumors that his wife poisoned
Oh,
as
maybe.
revenge. And after he died, if you look at Harding, you can understand why he might have had some he's way out of shape. He's a drinker. Any rate, that's sound no. At any rate, after he dies, his wife burns all of his personal and professional papers.
Oh, wow. Now, the first televised debate between presidents is Nixon-Kennedy, 1960. What kind of an impact? I mean, we always hear that the fact that it was televised was huge because Nixon with the makeup and this and that. Did it really have that big of an impact on the election, or is that just folklore?
That's folklore. It's a wonderful myth, that Nixon was sweaty and swarthy and Kennedy was smooth. And there's some truth to that. But it's very hard to know, virtually impossible to know, how any one event can affect an election. The only thing you have, which I don't endorse, but I'll just say it anyway, are the polls, right? And they didn't budge. The polls showed a dead heat before and after, and Kennedy won, of course, one of the narrowest presidential elections in history. And an election, that was marked by a lot of anti-Catholicism. Kennedy was only the second Catholic to run for president, and there was still a tremendous amount of anti-Catholicism we forget in America in 1960.
I believe that Martin Luther King Jr.'s father actually opposed Kennedy because of his Catholicism.
At least was questioning, yeah.
Yeah.
And so did Billy Graham.
That's the first was Al Smith, right? The first Catholic to run for the presidency.
Al Smith in 1928,
and
got
how did
obliterated.
He got obliterated? Okay.
Herbert Hoover, who then got obliterated by Franklin Roosevelt 4 years later.
Now, there's people out there that think that the 1960 election, that Nixon actually could have won, or maybe actually did win, but for some shenanigans going on in, I believe, Chicago. What is that all about?
That's a total myth. Even if he had won Chicago, wouldn't have been enough. Won Illinois. He had to win both Illinois and Texas. And Nixon himself wouldn't challenge. He said, look, I'm not going to be a sore loser. I'm going to imagine that. I'm going to accept the results. Of course, Nixon wanted to run again. But some of his supporters challenged the results. And while Illinois was close, Texas wasn't close. None of these challenges went anywhere. Probably there were some shenanigans in Cook County from, the infamous Mayor Daley, but there are also, I'm sure, shenanigans in Southern Illinois from the Republicans. But all of that is inconclusive. Nixon, I think, legitimately lost. But there's a wonderful anecdote about this, with Kennedy making fun of this idea that he won because of shenanigans in Cook County. One of his aides comes running up to him and says, look, Mr. President, the New York Times calls me coruscatingly brilliant because of how I run your campaign in Illinois. And Kennedy, had this habit of tapping his teeth and had this very dry wit. And he says, yes, Joe. And if Mayor Daley hadn't voted those graveyards in Cook County, they'd be calling you the coruscatingly stupid campaign. One of my favorite stories.
Another, an actual controversial election is Bush v. Gore. So why was it controversial? What's your view of it?
Oh boy, I am the world's expert on Bush v. Gore. I wrote the report for the very prestigious United States Commission on Civil Rights on what happened in Florida. I wrote a 2003 article in the Journal of Legal Studies. So, you want the long version or the short version?
Whatever's going to get us to the core of what took place. If you need to give
I'll
the
give you
long
the
version,
longer version
all
then.
right.
So I'm doing election night coverage like I always do. And Florida is called for Gore early on.
I
And I'm
remember that,
thinking,
yeah.
it's over. There's no Republican winning map without Florida. And then I'm in the studio and I'm called by a buddy of mine, Rich Bond, former chairman of the Republican National Committee. And he says, that call is wrong. It doesn't take into account our excellent absentee ballot operation in Florida. And I said, oh, I think you're right. I think this call was premature. And the call that Gore won the election is premature. Then the networks change their mind.
Yeah.
And they say, well, really, Bush won the election. And then they change their minds again and say, we have no idea who won this election because we don't know who won Florida. By that point, it was like the wee hours of the morning. I was on my fourth show, the BBC, and I became notorious for saying, I have three words for the networks: shame, shame, shame. And so we go into the post-election period not knowing who won Florida and who would be president, because whoever won the electoral votes of Florida would go over the top. Gore by about 24 votes and Bush by 1 vote. So everything turned on Florida, and the subsequent battle in Florida won by the Republicans. And, they were better prepared and they had better strategy. And the Democrats made a huge error, which may have cost them the election. They only called for a recount in a few selected counties. They should have called for a recount in all counties, which ultimately the Supreme Court did in Florida, but too late. That allowed the U.S. Supreme Court to step in and stop the voting, stop the recount, with just 537 votes that decided the election for Bush out of 6 million cast. And the recount was so important because 180,000 ballots were disqualified as invalid. And in fact, based upon a total review of all the ballots and what happened in Florida, Gore, based on the intent of the voters, should have won going away. I proved that in my report to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, where I found that 1 out of every 9 to 10 ballots cast by an African American was tossed as invalid. These are not voter suppression. This isn't keeping African Americans from the polls. This is African Americans who thought they voted, and they voted 95% for Gore. 1 out of 9 or 10 versus 1 out of 50 for whites. So if the ballot rejection rate for African American voters had not been 0, but the same as for whites, Gore would have won going away by tens of thousands of votes. And most of those disqualified ballots were not the hanging chads or the dimples. They were so-called overvotes, where Black voters were told, punch in Gore, but the punch isn't reliable, so write in Gore. Intention clear, but those votes were invalidated. So remarkably, I think maybe for the only time in U.S. history, the wrong person was elected president.
Now, the reason you mentioned, right, that they made the mistake of only asking for select counties to be counted is it's a 14th Amendment issue, right? Didn't the Supreme Court say, look, you can't just recount some votes, you have to recount all of them, but since they didn't have enough time to recount all of them before the certification was due, that's why they threw it out, right? Something
That was
along those
part of the
lines.
argument. And again, as I said, that all stems from the mistake. And there were some of us screaming at the time, call for a total state recount. And they didn't do it.
Why didn't they do it?
I don't know. To this day, I have no idea. Maybe they thought if they just recounted these large Democratic leaning states enough votes would go to them to give them the election. That's the only thing I can think of, but I'm not privy to their thinking. And I have to say, it reminds me of the famous line that Clarence Darrow used against William Jennings Bryan in the Scopes trial, which is, I don't know what you were thinking if you did think.
So we've got an upcoming election, Trump, Biden, and we've also got the RFK Jr. wild card. He's out there. What do you think's going to happen? Not just as far as who wins or loses. I mean, I want to know what you think about that as well, but the fallout from however it turns out.
Well, let me say, as you know, I have my own system for predicting elections, the 13 keys to the White House, which I developed in 1981 in collaboration with Vladimir Kailas-Borak, and which has been right in predicting elections for the last 40 years. No other system comes close. And the way it works is based on the proposition that American presidential elections are essentially votes up or down on the strength and performance of the White House party, and the challenges have very little to do with the outcomes. And the 13 keys are 13 true-false questions that probe the strength and performance of the White House party. And if 6 or more are false, they're predicted losers. Fewer than 6, the White House party is a predicted winner. And I haven't made a final prediction yet, but I have said, contrary to the polls and the pundits, and I've been saying this for some time, a lot would have to go wrong over the next several months for Joe Biden to lose this election.
See, first of all, I think that both parties have nominated the one guy that the other party has a chance of beating. Let
me dispute that. Let me dispute that, because I've heard that a lot, and no disrespect for you, because you're
no, it's fine. I'm not an expert on the topic. I'm a layman.
The keys to the White House fundamentally contradict that. That the only chance Democrats have to win is for Biden to be running. Let me explain.
Really?
I have an incumbency key, right?
Okay.
I have a party contest key. Biden wins both those keys. Obviously, he's the incumbent and he hasn't been challenged. That's 2 keys he wins off the top. Under my system, 6 more keys would have to fall out of the remaining 11 to predict his defeat. That's why I've said a lot of things would have to go wrong. But presume Biden doesn't run. The Democrats lose the incumbency key and they lose the party contest key because there's no heir apparent. So they then start 2 keys down, and only 4 more keys would have to fall to predict their defeat. So while you're right, it seems on the surface, Democrats could do better than Biden. But when you look at it systematically in terms of a prediction model, the opposite is true.
And what about the Republicans? Could they have done better than Trump?
Doesn't matter. As I said,
okay.
elections turn on the
Those
strength
keys.
and performance of the White House party.
Now, as far as what's going to occur, it seems to me, and I don't like either one of them. I wouldn't vote for either one of them. So I don't have a horse in the race. But I do think
you're not going to vote.
No. But I can't. I'm a convicted felon. I can't vote anyway. But even if I could, I wouldn't vote for either.
You should be able to vote. By the way, I'm sorry about that.
No, it's okay. I wouldn't vote anyways. I don't.
But that's another holdover from those Jim Crow days when they try to keep blacks from voting.
So I don't see. I think if Trump were to win, I think it's going to be a disaster for the country. And I think if Trump loses, I don't think he's going to concede he lost. I think we're going to go through the same thing that we've been going through, where people still believe Trump won the election. They can go to their given source that's going to tell them what they want to hear, and that's it. And I don't know how. I mean, the country will survive. So I don't want to say I don't know how the country will survive. I just don't know how it's not going to be a virtual nightmare to be living through this.
I don't entirely disagree with you, but let me push back about what would happen if Biden wins, which I think I haven't made a final prediction, but as I said, a lot would have to go wrong for him to lose. I don't think you're going to see the same upsurge that you saw in 2020. Look, Trump has called for his MAGA troops to rally around him, right? While
Mm-hmm.
he's sitting in the dock for criminal charges in New York.
Mm-hmm.
And who showed up? Nobody. The streets are empty of MAGA protesters. He doesn't have the same cachet to bring out the mob that he did in 2020. The
Okay.
other difference is he's not the sitting president. In 2020, remember, he was still the sitting president with
That's
all the
true.
power and prestige of being president. And that, took him a long way in, instigating these challenges. He won't have that kind of power this time. So I don't expect him to concede, but I don't think you're going to get upheavals of the magnitude that many have feared.
Fair enough. That's why you're the expert and I'm the podcast
But
host.
you could be right. Who knows? I don't have that kind of hubris to say I'm always right, although I'm always right in my predictions.
What did you predict in 2000? I'm curious.
It's a long story. I predicted Gore, and I think that was correct because it was a stolen election.
Yeah.
I went on the Bill Maher show in 2020 to give my 2020 prediction, which was Biden. And the first thing, Bill Maher likes to mess with his guests like you do. It's great. And first thing he asked me is, Lichtman, how did you fuck up in 2000? Those are his exact words. And I said, I didn't. It was a stolen election. And I gave him a more abbreviated version of the same thing I explained in more depth on your podcast. So I think we are wrapping up soon. So if you have a couple more questions.
The only question I have is where can people find you?
Yes. The best way to find me, I have a live show every Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern. That's Thursday, 9 p.m. Eastern. It's on YouTube. And you find me at Allan Lichtman YouTube.
At Allan Lichtman YouTube.
We've been running it for about 6 months, and we already have 6,200 subscribers. And I did a CNN interview you may check out. It's also on YouTube. Just Google Lichtman CNN, talking about some of the same things you and I have talked about, and it's gotten 1.7 million YouTube views. That's unheard of for a CNN interview. That's more viewers than CNN gets, way more.
All right, Professor. Thank you very much for taking your time to be with us today. I really appreciate it.
Great interview, Michael, and send me a link. Take care.
I will. Take care.